So let's start with corn. We're here on the first day of May, and it looks like we're not going to plant for at least a week, maybe 10 days at this point for a good part of the state of Illinois. What's the yield impact? And well, let's start with yield impact, but I want to talk about whether they should get out on, how soon they should get out on those soils too.
It's always a difficult thing. We've been through these spells when it looks like it's never going to stop raining for a lot of times over the years, including last year. In 2018, the year when we produced our record high corn yield in Illinois, we didn't get an early start. And April was cool and pretty wet. Whenever it's cool, it tends to stay wet. So we're really hoping for temperatures as much as we're hoping for dry weather now. We need to find a way to dry up this water, and it certainly doesn't dry when the high during the day is in the 40s or even 50s. So we started late last year, but we finished early. And if you had asked people the 1st of May, well, how soon do you think we'll get this planted? Some would have said not very quickly because it's been raining and it's not drying up very fast. I just say that to say that things can change pretty quickly. We've usually had them change pretty quickly at some point. The question's always when that point is going to be. But we're hopeful. As May gets warmer, of course, the drying times get to be a little bit less. We also know that it's not going to be, the soil is not going to be in great shape when people first want to get started. We do have some corn planted. We planted about, we planted about half of the variety trials, the corn hybrid trials. Then it gets cold and gets really wet, and then you say, should we have done that? Well, in 2017, we had a lot planted right before the big deluge set in, and it got cool end of April, first part of May, just like this year. That was one of those years when we got higher yields if we waited to plant till mid-May than if we planted there in late April before that heavy rainfall set in. So you just take your chances and you plant when you can. Our data are showing that we think yield losses as planting is delayed are a little bit less severe than they were. And I think the main reason for that is that our hybrids are so much better than they were. So if we think of it in those terms, first of all, we need enough growing season to get the crop mature. Well, in my 40 years, we've seen corn planted late, we've seen corn planted early, and I have not, at least here in central Illinois, ever seen frost end the season before the crop was mature. So that's a fear that, we really probably don't need to have. Although up in northern Illinois and in the northern half of the Corn Belt, people still have gotten in the habit a little bit of pushing some fairly late hybrids for that region. And 110 or 112 day hybrid might need pretty much all the growing degree days you can get to get it mature. And if you get delayed in planting by 2 weeks or a month, it can push it depending on how the fall goes. So there's always that. But here, for most of Illinois, we have a pretty good safety factor built in in terms of what growing degree days there will be in a season. And last year, we all remember with a very warm May, we had maturity coming on the end of August, and we didn't use much of the whole month of September to grow the crop. We used it to dry it down. So that's some safety that we've got on that. But on the idea of yield loss, and we show yield losses based on the data, the trials that we've run, they don't get to 20% loss until we get planting into June. And it starts out slowly. The first week of May is really a pretty good time to plant. And as it gets later than that, it starts to accelerate a little bit. But it's a fairly mild curve. And just about any time we plant in May, in some of our trials, we get almost our best yields. So that's, I think, because the stresses in the mid-season stresses that we're always trying to avoid by planting early don't take as much a toll on this crop as they did it with older hybrids. And I'm not going to say we're just going to get high yields and it doesn't matter what happens, because it does. But I think part of the message is that what happens in July and August is always much more important than what happens in May or April or when we get the crop planted.
Conventional wisdom for producers says I should get my corn in before I get my soybeans in, especially given the wet conditions. And the soybeans just have a trouble coming up, they break their neck coming out of the ground after it's crusted over, those sorts of things. However, there is an undercurrent that says go ahead and plant the beans because the vigor is so good anymore. It will make it through the soils. And when you look at our crop progress reports, even in Illinois, while corn is way behind, soybean planting is not.
Well, soybean planting is behind corn planting, but it's not behind what it normally has been. The ideal is that we can plant both crops at the same time, and you know, we can just sort of intermix them and use that 15-inch row planter to plant the soybeans the same time we're planting corn. And more people do that. But others have gotten big planters and they use them for both crops, and so they can't be planting both of them, at least with every planter at the same time. It's a tough call, but realistically in April, if it's getting late, it's been fairly cool. The weather forecast, at least over the last month, has never said clear sailing ahead, you know, it's going to dry up and not rain for 2 weeks. Given those set of circumstances, corn is still safer to put into the ground than soybeans. This heavy rain that we just had, you know, is really going to do a number on soybeans. I would expect a lot of them will be a candidate for replanting, because that's just what happens. 2 years ago we replanted a huge amount of corn, so corn certainly isn't immune from that. It's lack of oxygen that kills both of these. It will kill soybeans a little bit faster than it will kill corn. But if it gets wet and stays wet, neither one of those seeds is going to come up very well. We have the advantage with soybeans of planting more seeds than we need to have plants. In corn, we really would like everyone to come up, and so there is that. But we have very seldom seen really bad emergence conditions where people would be happy if they planted, you know, 175,000 seeds, but would have to replant if they planted 150,000 seeds. It just doesn't work that way. You know, bad conditions are bad conditions, and where water stands for a little bit this time of year after the crop has been planted, as long as it's cool, the crop's not trying to germinate, so it will last for a while. But it can't sit there without oxygen forever. And it certainly can't germinate and emerge without a good oxygen supply around the seed.
Farmers have the tractors ready to roll. Many of them have not turned a wheel. They're going to want to be out as quickly as possible. What situations should they avoid at all costs?
I'm a little bit concerned. Our recent research has been telling us that corn really needs some nitrogen there, particularly if the soils are cool. And many people are going to say the first thing I want to do is plant, and we'll worry about nitrogen later. And that's become sort of standard advice. And I've given that advice myself, but I haven't given it in the last couple of years, because we've seen cases where a delay in putting on the first nitrogen on the corn crop can actually cut the yield potential. I don't want to be alarmist about it, but I think we need to find a way to put some nitrogen on this crop right at planting or right after planting. Is putting on, using solution nitrogen as a herbicide carrier going to do the job? It can do the job if it gets down to where the seed is, but we're not putting on very high rates there. And if the soils are cool, then the mineralization is going to be delayed, and the soil, as we saw last year with cool April, the soil really didn't, come forth with an abundance of nitrogen, at least until the soils had warmed up considerably. So we think there's a time fairly early in the life of the plant, corn plant, after it emerges, that it really needs to start finding nitrogen in the water that it's taking up, or it can have its yield compromised a little bit.
Okay, given that, I'm going to say that on the 7th of May, if things are ready, you would put anhydrous on and wait. On the 14th, the 21st, and the 28th.
I'd rather see if they can do it using RTK. I'd rather see people put nitrogen on close to the row, either right after or right before or sometime before they plant. And if it were possible to be out there putting nitrogen on, 8 inches off of the row before you plant, I think that'd be a good way to go. 24-row toolbar is a pretty big toolbar, and it's a little scary for some people about trying to keep it in position to follow it with a 24-row planter. And we need to be careful with it, but normally the concern about injury from anhydrous is a little bit overblown. We just know that it can be bad, and it was one time in our memory or two. But in the soils, particularly in the darker soils, and with the rainfall patterns we've had, it really has to get pretty dry for a while before ammonia will move back up. And I wouldn't be too concerned about that. If we can direct it in the same direction as the rows, in other words, most people want to put it on a slight angle. If we decide not to do that and can lay it, even if it was between the rows, the reason I like it closer to the row than 15 inches is because the crop is going to reach it quicker. And so that would be one way to go about it. And if we could manage that at about the time we plant, I'd have less concern about the crop, finding a time when it needs nitrogen and it's not finding it.
Okay, finally, there was anhydrous applied last fall. Probably in wetter conditions maybe than some would want. It's been there an awfully long time now. What concerns do you have? What should people be watching for?
Well, our conditions for turning it to nitrate and having it leave the scene are not any greater than they normally have been, although it's been awfully wet. And the report I get is that some of it's finding its way to tile lines already, which means it was nitrate. Not too much concern in general. If they're going to be doing tillage pass in it, well, that probably helps to disperse it a little bit, but I wouldn't have much concern about it. If it's there, it's there. Again, I'd probably almost rather have it, running with the rows, off the rows, than at an angle. But an angle puts the row close to the nitrogen for quite a bit of the distance you're driving, so that's not too bad either. No, I would act right now as if that nitrogen was all there, and if we see unexpected deficiencies 3 weeks, 4 weeks after we plant, we might want to consider the possibility of going back. But we'll deal with that and putting some more on. But we'll deal with that when the time comes.